Well, yesterday we lost part of the video because even though I asked if the video recorder was fully charged, excuse me, it was not recharged, and so I talked for about, I don't know, 20 minutes before I realized that I was talking to myself. That's fun. So, going back over the video from yesterday, it seems that it stopped about right here on number 6. What this was about was the benefits of trade, free trade. And so okay, these are the benefits and the arguments that people make for free trade. Free trade is probably, and free trade agreements are probably one of the more controversial topics in international business these days. There are competing interests, right? Like any economic situation. So depending on your interests, you have a different point of view about the positive or negative effects of trade. So, for example, here, I think it was the last one. The last one was peace, yeah. So again, I think I explained about that already. So number 6 is levels the playing field. It says that it breaks up monopolistic and oligopolistic power as more buyers and sellers come into the market. Okay, so we have two different things happening in international trade. We have the domestic situation, and then we have the international situation. So we have the firms that are in the country, the smaller companies who have market share within the country, and then we have the international multinational corporations who go across countries and are not so involved in the individual country's legal situation. So here, though, the argument for benefit to free trade is that inside a country, there are some businesses that dominate market share, and because they dominate, they become monopolies or oligopolies. Oligopolies are groups of companies who function like a monopoly. Monopolies are traditionally bad for consumers because consumers have nowhere to turn, and so therefore they're at the mercy of the company. So if you add competition, to the environment, it should make these monopolies who don't feel any need to be efficient have to compete and have to get better at what they do. So just be more efficient, and customers have more choice. It's good for everyone, supposedly. And when you read this or when you mention this as an advantage of free trade, you should focus it on the country itself, because that's maybe true for the country, but the real reason why people talk about this in terms of free trade agreements is that most countries who are developing, who have monopolies, are usually state-run companies. The same is true for Vietnam. A free trade agreement which was proposed to us about 4 years ago, no, 6 years ago, but 4 years ago it got canceled by Donald Trump, was going to put Vietnam in a situation where you were going to have to privatize your biggest state-owned companies. Now you might think, okay, well, state-owned companies are inefficient. They're big and they don't have to answer to anybody. But there's usually a reason why we have state-run companies. Whether it's because they're running healthcare services or an education system or something important to the country like management of energy or water. So usually we have these systems here because we don't want to have profits made from them, and we want the security of the country to be good. So state-run businesses can be okay. I mean, you don't want various electric companies competing and having price wars over your energy supply. I mean, maybe in the short run, that might be good. You might get a lower price, but in the end, the price is going to go up and down. There'll be insecurity in the market. So something like power or water, you want to make sure that you have enough of that. And it's okay for the government to run those businesses. But free traders, they say that all business can be run, or should be run, in a private way. So that's why they argue about breaking up these different companies. It's hard to argue against the idea that innovation and technology has not been exchanged because of free trade. Yes, I can agree with that. So one of the reasons why is because we need standards, right? We need to have standards for production, for communication, and for this is terrible. Excuse me. And for actually, for being able to monitor. So a company like DHL is a shipping company. They need to be able to have the same standards in each country in order to track their goods and services to help their customers. And with a free trade agreement, that technology gets shared with Vietnam, China, and everyone else. So technology spreads, and idea and hopefully innovation will increase with competition. Economies of scale. Now this one is weird, right? Because on the one hand, number 6 says that, well, we'll have more competition. There'll be breakups of monopolies, and that'll be great because that'll create more efficiency in the market. But on the other hand, they say here, economies of scale. Companies can take advantage of economies of scale on an international level. So on a domestic level or a one country level, it's supposed to increase competition. But on an international level, these companies get so big because they expand so much that they get huge economies of scale, which makes them more competitive than the domestic markets, domestic firms, domestic companies, much more. So those two things are against each other. So the companies that are in the country cannot really compete because they don't have economies of scale. So basically, I think what it ends up happening is because of these two different forces is that multinational companies become monopolies. And so that's not really good either. So they're trying to say that there's a benefit on both sides, even though there's a winner and loser in this situation. We know that there's a lot of monopolies out there. There's only 3 or 4 different beer sellers in the, big beer sellers in the world. Facebook, Google, we have these technological companies that go across borders that are virtual monopolies that everybody has to use. Imagine trying to do a week without Google. Try it. Try to get Google out of your life for just 1 week. It's very difficult. So this economies of scale is for the companies that are outside of the countries that go across borders. And when they talk about more competition because of free trade, they mean the companies inside the country. So there's a little bit of a strange controversy there. Number 9, maybe entrepreneurship is increased because companies have to be, if they're more competitive, they have to find new ways to produce things and become more efficient. Growth. Okay, so the ultimate argument of trade is, again, what we said before, is that the absolute advantage and specialization, if you put those two things together, it means that you should be able to find something that each country can produce that's going to allow for there to be a greater amount of production overall, and that should, so there will be a higher GDP or total wealth, and so as a result, everyone's better off because there's more of everything. That's fair to a point, but it also depends on who gets the benefits of that extra wealth, right? The wealth is only part of the story. Creation of wealth and then distribution of wealth. Which leads us to this is a good video, but I want to save that. To our book. So I'll go to our book. So if you were going to write on a test, what would be the benefits of free trade? Those 10 things would be fair to talk about. You don't need to know 10 things. I think on an exam they would probably ask about 3. All right. So in our book on page 21, I went through the first few paragraphs before we got cut off last class, or 2 classes ago now, the first time we got cut off. So I'm going to start from the 3rd paragraph. So the main benefits of free trade are that you get lower taxes, or the free trade agreements. The main topics that they cover are lowering taxes and tariffs and standardizing regulations and logistics between the countries and customs. So standardization and taxation. Trade negotiations result in governments committing to free trade agreements. Free trade agreements are made between countries and to form trading regions. So there's 2 main kinds of trading trade agreements. Bilateral means 2 countries, and multilateral means a group of countries. An example of a bilateral would be the New Zealand and Australian. Here's an example of it. It's the Australian New Zealand Free Trade Agreement. And then another example of a bloc, a trading bloc, is what we're in. We're in the ASEAN. There's about 10 or 12 countries, maybe more, involved. Philippines, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Brunei, and there might be one I'm missing, but I'm not sure. That might be it. So most of the countries in the SEA Games, that's a trading bloc. Usually it's done in a region, it's done in an area of mutual interest. Australia has signed a range of trade agreements that regulate business operating globally. Trade agreements undergo a process of review and negotiation. An example of a free trade agreement is one involving tariffs and customs duties on agricultural products like wheat or apples. 2 or more countries agree to standardize their custom duties and tariffs, to reduce them or remove them. This means that each country can export their produce to other countries and sell it at a similar price as the local produce is, depending on how much it costs to produce it. So that allows for the comparative advantage to be used, and for countries, basically it just allows us to take advantage of comparative advantage. The next example is about pharmaceuticals. This is quite confusing, and I think that it's not really worth going through those paragraphs directly. But I will explain what those paragraphs are trying to tell us. Free trade agreement called the TPP, which we'll have to look at in detail, basically cover about 35% of the entire global economy, which included Southeast Asia, it included Australia, Japan, pretty much Korea, everything except China around here, and the US. One of the main reasons that Donald Trump became president is that he opposed that agreement. That agreement was going to have many different effects on Vietnam in particular, and it was very similar to the NAFTA free trade agreement that occurred in 1996, because the economies of Mexico and Vietnam are quite similar. So usually when you have a free trade agreement, you have countries that have a similar developmental level, and when you mix countries that are developed and developing, it has very strange effects and pretty negative ones for the developing country. So Vietnam was actually saved by Donald Trump in this situation. Besides tariffs, there were some other elements to this free trade agreement. One of them had to do with pharmaceutical products, or medicine, or drugs, if you will. Now, there are two kinds of drugs. If you go to a store, sometimes, especially because I'm a Nuinukwai, when I go to the store, they offer me some expensive French medicine. But I know that this medicine is actually the same as the Vietnamese medicine. They have two names. One name for the French medicine and one name for the Vietnamese medicine. But actually, they're the same medicine. Why do they have two names? Because one is a brand and one is the chemical. So I don't want to pay for the brand. The brand is a product of marketing, some rather perhaps strange IP patents that are French or American. And so you're paying for that. So, of course, it's very controversial whether or not drugs should be cheaper because people need them, or companies should be able to make huge profits over them because they have a patent. So, the companies patent the brand, but there's something called generic drugs and generic treaties for drugs that countries like Australia are able to produce similar drugs without the branding. Australia's healthcare system is run by the government. So they're not privatized. They are run publicly. They're not run for profit. They're run to provide a service for everyone. Whereas American healthcare is run for profit. So this free trade agreement between Australia, Vietnam, and Australia was supposed to eliminate this second kind of drugs, the cheaper drugs, and force the Australian government to pay the retail prices of all the drugs that they use, and also Vietnam. So can you imagine if you're going to a Vietnamese pharmacy and you always have to buy the French drugs? You can't buy the Vietnamese ones, they're eliminated. How much would that cost everybody? That would be incredibly expensive. So, free trade agreements, depending on the negotiating position of the partners, can be difficult and not necessarily benefit, especially when you have more than one country. If you have a bilateral negotiation, you can look out for your own best interests. But if you try to standardize too many tariffs for too many products over too many countries, everybody's, each country's situation is so different that you end up with some countries that actually don't benefit from that and actually lose. So that's what that's about. That says that, it's in the last paragraph, Australia's pharmaceutical benefit scheme, by requiring wholesale prices paid to drug companies to be based on market prices rather than the existing process of comparison with similar but lower cost drugs. So it was going to cost the Australian government a lot of money to sign that agreement. It's very complicated. I don't know why the book talks about it there. Anyway, let's think about free trade agreements in general. One thing that I noticed on the exam that I looked at yesterday is that they're really pushing, I don't know what happened here. Well, that some of the things on the test that were there last time were very specific to, and I've never seen them before, were very specific to the syllabus, including features and role of free trade agreements, including ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand. So I think I need to cover that a little bit. But our book is not very good, so I'll try to give you the best I can give from that, what I can talk about. Now, the question about the Australia-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement asked about the features of the actual trade agreement, which is in our book a little bit, but not that much. And but for the most part, it would be similar to what we understand about standards and lower tariffs. So if you were in a hard situation, that's how you would answer that question. Looking at other free trade agreements between Australia and Korea, I would just take a note here if I was watching, and I would say, okay, when I look at these discussions about free trade agreements, I think about what are the free trade agreements, like what are they trying to, well, they're trying to foster trade. The role of free trade agreements is to increase trade, and hopefully that leads to more wealth for both countries and better outcomes and taxes for each country, etc. The features have to do with tariffs, lowering tariffs, taxes, and streamlining customs, and creating standards for maybe food safety, for example. So that's what that's about. So when I show this video, I would hope that you would, this is from the book, it's at the bottom of page 21, Korea-Australia Agreement Details. In this case, they're discussing some of the features. Okay, what kind of things are they trying to, how are they lowering taxes? How much, what kind of tax situation are they lowering? Are they talking about standards, creating standards? And also, what kind of products are being exchanged?
As much as $650 million a year. Australia's economy could be boosted by as much as $650 million a year once a free trade agreement between Australia and South Korea is formalised.
2 months after negotiations concluded, details of the deal were today released. While consumers seeking new electronic goods and cars look set to benefit, the big winner is Australia's beef industry.
Australia has a long economic history with South Korea. In 1989, Bob Hawke sparked the idea for the APEC concept in Seoul.
A more formal vehicle for regional cooperation.
Today, details of a bilateral agreement, all 1,800 pages of them, between the two countries was unveiled.
The elimination of 99.8% of tariffs on things that we export to Korea.
South Korea is Australia's third largest trading partner, buying $19 billion worth of Australian goods and services each year. Trade is expected to be 23% higher by 2030 as a result of the agreement.
Well, basically, Korea has no energy and not much livestock, so they're very dependent on food security and energy.
Korea will gradually phase out tariffs, but the effect will be immediate for priority products like liquefied natural gas and automotive parts, along with raw sugar, wheat and wine. Duty-free quotas for dairy will be eliminated over 20 years. Beef's 40% tariff will go over 15 years.
But it wasn't until the BSE scare, the mad cow scare, that Australia really got into the market.
In fact, Australia supplies 2/3 of Korea's beef market.
It is also restoring our competitive position with the United States and the EU and the ASEAN countries who already struck a couple of years ago agreements with Korea.
Locally, the agreement will mean some of the world's best-known Korean consumer brands will become more affordable.
Korean-made cars like Kia and Hyundai may become cheaper once their 5% import tariff, which was originally designed to protect the Australian car manufacturing industry, is reduced.
Unions, though, are calling the FTA a cows for car deal.
Unfortunately, it's at the expense of Australian manufacturing and Australian manufacturing jobs.
It comes as the Bureau of Statistics said new car sales fell last month by 3.5%. The Korea-Australia Free Trade Agreement is expected to be signed within months and is likely to come into force by the end of this year, giving some a reason to dance. Ricardo Gonçalves, SBS World News.
Okay, so if you were looking at that, they talked about lowering tariffs by up to 99%, and they said they were going to phase it in over a certain time period. I think it was over 20 years or 15. The main exchange goods was energy, I think it was natural gas and beef going to Korea, and Korean companies being able to export electronics and cars to Australia. So seems like a good exchange. They said the benefit of that agreement will be an increase of something like $700 or $800 million a year over what the current trade is, which is about $16 billion. South Korea is the third biggest trading partner of Australia. So anyway, that's a very general analysis of a free trade agreement. You don't really need to have much more than that. If they talked about some other elements that would be streamlined, that would make sense. So I'm not going to talk about the, let's finish page 22 up until China. And then I'm going to talk about the New Zealand agreement for a couple minutes. And I think that's what I'll do today. Another proposal by the U.S. is to give U.S. companies operating, another proposal by the U.S. is to give U.S. companies operating in other countries the right to sue governments over policies and laws that affect their sales and profits. For example, U.S. tobacco companies could sue the Australian government for losses that result from Australia's plain packaging for cigarettes. It's nice to talk about this in person because I think it's very shocking. This thing is called ISDS. So it's the International Settlement Dispute. We have a question about it in our section. It's Investor-State Dispute Settlements. It's on page 32. Investor-State Dispute Settlement, ISDS. This ISDS is a very weird thing. So dispute means, disagreement. Investor, state. State is government. Investor is shareholder. So basically, what this part of the free trade agreement was supposed to do was to protect investors from losing money based on changes that happen inside the country. So we know that laws are a P factor, pest factor, P, political. So developing countries, what happens is when big companies first go and manufacture in a developing country, they don't really care about the environment very much. The developing country is willing to accept this because they want to have some kind of trade or they want to do business with other countries. So they can't really argue about these things too much. But as the developing country gets stronger, they want to increase the protections they have on their environment. They want to protect their environment, pass new laws. The employees who got paid very low wages, and that's the main reason why companies came there, to get low-cost workers. But now their workers are starting to improve their skills and standards. They want to raise the minimum wage. They want to be able to have their workers make more money and reach the middle class. So what ISDS would do would penalize the government for changing the law. So if the company comes from the US and you raise the minimum wage and that costs the company more money for workers, then the American company can use ISDS to sue the Vietnamese government for lost profits. That's right, lost profits. And not only lost profits today, lost future profits. So this has actually happened, it's a new thing. It's been happening for about 10 or 12 years now. And they established this international court, which is controlled by companies, not governments. And they determined that, well, yes, the government has hurt the profits of the company, so they have to pay. It's happened many times. The example they give here now was a big court case about the Australian plain packaging laws. Australians are trying to make cigarettes not cool. When you have a brand of cigarettes, people look at your brand, you look at their brand. Is your brand better than my brand? Do I smoke the same brand as my friends? By taking all the packaging off and making only plain white covered cigarette packages, the Australian government thought that would be a good way of eliminating this image around smoking. The cigarette companies thought that cost them money. Okay, the Australian government is very clear. They're trying to lower cigarette sales. They don't want people to smoke. The prices are very high, the taxes are very high. And so they got sued by the cigarette companies for lost future profits. And that's what ISDS is. And it's very strange, very strange. And what it means is that governments get to challenge public policy. So it causes your government to have less power, right? So then it's the whole issue that we've talked about from the beginning of globalization is that companies are multinational and countries are just their own countries. So how does a country use national law to maintain control over multinational companies? So this is something that moves the power from the national government to make regulations, laws, environmental laws, minimum wages, for example, and it limits their ability to do that and gives companies more power over them. So that's what that's about. I think I will give you a short video about ISDS because it's very strange. Let's try this one.
I am Kalika.
Wow, that's the Thai one. We'll try this one.
What is ISDS? The EU is hoping to attract foreign investors with new international agreements. Thereby, potential partners are being promised a special privilege, the Investor-State Dispute Settlement, ISDS. ISDS allows investors to take legal action against government measures at private arbitration tribunals. Here, it is not independent judges making the decisions, but lawyers with close ties to business. This exclusive power of proceedings could cost us and our democracy very dearly. The response to the nuclear phase-out is a case in point. Energy.
This is one example. Germany decided that nuclear power was unsafe, so they wanted to eliminate nuclear power. So guess what? The international companies sued them to try to get damages for loss of their future profits.
Companies are not happy that Germany has opted to abandon nuclear energy, and so E.ON and RWE have launched legal proceedings at the German Federal Constitutional Court. If this wasn't enough, the Swedish company Vattenfall is appealing at a private ISDS arbitration tribunal, where it is demanding 3.7 billion euros in compensation. These tribunals take place behind closed doors, and case documents are almost always kept secret. Decisions are made by 3 lawyers who work for major private law firms. Depending on the case, these lawyers can simply switch roles. sometimes prosecutor, other times on the defense, or even acting as arbitrating judge. Moreover, these unaccountable figures have the power to overturn the judgments of the constitutional courts. Throughout, the arbitrators are earning big sums. $1,000 per hour is not unusual. In the background, their law firms lobby the corporations to sue as often as possible, or help them to establish subsidiaries in certain countries so they can file yet more ISDS lawsuits. This trick was employed by Canadian company Lone Pine, which shifted its headquarters to the United States in order to sue Canada for its ban on fracking. The arbitrators also help corporations to raise funds for further.
So, fracking is a very unsafe and very polluting way of getting natural gas. One of the companies that wanted to use this method of gaining natural gas, they were a Canadian company. They were being blocked by the government. So what they did is they moved their headquarters, their office, to the U.S. The U.S. has a free trade agreement with Canada. So then, in that free trade agreement, they have the ISDS. So a Canadian company could not sue the Canadian government for what the government's laws are. They're in the same country. The national laws apply to all the companies. But because they did, I don't know if it was legal or not, but they moved their headquarters to the U.S. Now they were in an international situation, so they sued the Canadian government against the government for having a law to prevent this very unclean way of extracting natural gas. So an actual company went to another country so they could use international law to sue their own country. That's how crazy this law is. This is called ISDS.
Lawsuits. The significant legal costs are paid upfront by investors in return for a share of the profits. It's a thriving business, at the expense of taxpayers, the environment, and hard-won social achievements. If the state is unwilling or unable to pay up, the only recourse is to abolish the very regulations that the corporations are objecting to. This was the fate of the environmental standards for the coal-fired power plant in Hamburg-Moorburg. These were ditched because the owner, Vattenfall, demanded 1.4 billion euros in compensation. Just the threat of ISDS lawsuits can mean that measures to protect the environment, consumers, and social standards fail to become enacted at all. The number of ISDS lawsuits is rising rapidly. To date, there are 568 known cases worldwide. Among other things, corporations are suing to block a raising of the minimum wage, block health protection measures, overturn a ban on toxic waste dumping in a drinking water area, block compensation for victims of apartheid, block the repeal of water privatization, or block the terms of bank bailouts. Lawsuits of this kind will occur ever more frequently if the planned agreement with the USA and Canada enters into force. These two agreements alone would allow more than 100,000 companies to circumvent our constitutional democracy.
Yes, go around the democracy of the country. That's what that's all about. So that's ISDS. I will actually give you a homework question so you can look at it a little bit more closely. I'm still on page 22. Free trade agreements. So that's the question. Why is this investor protection in the free trade agreement? They'll say that it's because it's like insurance, because investors don't want to invest unless they feel that it's safe to invest in that country. That's understandable, but when the lawyers use it as an excuse to sue countries that try to regulate their own country's laws, that's not really what it's meant for. Free trade agreements can create opportunities for Australian exporters and investors to expand their business into overseas markets. So that would be the role. Okay, so if we go back to our syllabus, that would be the role can create opportunities for Australian exporters and investors to expand their business into overseas markets. They can provide access to overseas markets in all areas of trade, such as goods, services, but that's the last one again, ISDS, investment. Access to markets and a reduction in tariffs increases the competitiveness of Australian businesses. As any part of any free trade agreement, Australia must remove trade barriers to make it easier and less expensive for imports. Reducing trade barriers improves outcomes for consumers because it gives them easier access to more choice and lower prices. It also increases competitive pressure on domestic, in other words, Australian industry. Australian businesses now have to also compete with foreign businesses on a level playing field. This pressure motivates business people to innovate and improve their efficiency in order to survive. So that was the original idea about why that would be good, is that it's going to help companies, well, not help them, but force them into being more efficient, which should be good for us, the consumer, and hopefully more efficient for the use of resources and the environment. That's the goal, but as we can see that there are some negatives to this situation. The opposite of reducing tariffs and free trade is called protectionism. And there's a few reasons why countries might want to protect their industries. So, why would someone want to protect? So, I think I will see if I can.
Are you looking forward to make investment? Have you ever thought that Warren Buffett could help you make investment?
Hi there. Let's take a quick look at what we mean by the concept of protectionism. Protectionism is the opposite of open or free trade. It's any attempt.
Protectionism is the opposite of free trade.
By a country to restrict, to impose restrictions on trade. Trade both in terms of physical goods as well as services. And of course, if you're keeping on top of the news, you'll know that this is an increasingly important and significant feature of global business and the global economy, specifically the threat of a trade war between the world's two largest economies, the US and China. So lots of examples of protectionism in the news. There are different types of protectionism, so let's just quickly go through the four main kinds. Firstly, tariffs. A tariff is a tax, sometimes otherwise known as a duty, and the tariff is imposed on one or more imported products into a country. And the aim is to try to reduce demand for imported products that are subject to the tariff, as well as to encourage the supply of the same product domestically, on the basis that the domestic suppliers should have a cost advantage. Their products should be more competitive. Lots of examples of tariffs. For example, in the bicycles market, the European Union imposes a tariff on imported bicycles from China of around about 48-50%, I think, and similarly in the US there is a tariff on the import of UK-made bicycles of around about 10 or 11%. So there's tariffs. Also, another form of protectionism is import quotas. This is where there is a physical.
Okay, tariffs are fairly easy to understand. Tariffs are just taxes that are put on products that are imported into your market. Why do you want to do that? Because you want to limit how much you want to protect your local businesses against competition that would be unfair. I've used the example a few times. If Chung Nguyen had to compete with Nescafe directly with their total free trade agreement, they would probably lose. Nescafe is too big. So if we have tariffs on products, coffee products from outside Vietnam, we can protect our local coffee industry. Maybe someday, Trung Nguyen will get strong enough or big enough or efficient enough that in a developing country we'll be able to compete on an international level. But until then, you have to grow your businesses like a baby. You have to get them strong enough to be able to compete on an international level. So that's one main reason for protectionism and tariffs. A quota, I'll describe it very quickly. A quota is when you just set a limit of how much can be exported to a country. The U.S. has lots of quotas with Vietnam for different products, whether it's cashews or fruits and vegetables, and I'm not sure about rice, but quotas are, the price is the same, so there's no taxes on it, but there's a limit on the amount. So this is based on how much your local economy or your domestic producer can produce, and you figure, okay, we can have this much competition or this much goods coming into the country. After that, it's going to create competitive problems. So a volume limit of the level of imports allowed.
Called limit on the volume of imports of particular products that are allowed into an economy over a certain amount of time. The quota could mean that they are tariff-free, or the quota could allow the products to be subject to a lower tariff than normal. So lots of examples of quotas, for example, sheep. The New Zealand sheep market, one of the world's largest, the world's largest market for production of sheep, and they're allowed to bring in a certain tonnage of sheep and goat meat each year into the EU. And of course, import quotas are negotiated between economies, in this case between the EU and the New Zealand authorities. A third type of protectionism is subsidy. This is where a government pays domestic producers an incentive to lower their costs. That's the essential feature of a subsidy, on the basis that it will hopefully provide those domestic producers with a cost advantage over international competitors. We've got the example on the screen there.
So the U.S. government, it says, spends around $2 billion per year, $2 billion, paying farmers to support them, to make them competitive on the international market. So subsidies, that's coming from a taxpayer. I don't know if everybody had a choice in that, they would want to do that.
The US government spends billions of dollars a year subsidising domestic peanut growers to make them more competitive. And fourthly, don't forget, protectionism can also be through the legislation and regulation that exists within a particular country. And I've put on the screen there 2 or 3 different types of regulation and legislation. For example, there could be controls around intellectual property or IP, perhaps around patents and copyright protection. That's designed to protect domestic providers. And similarly, there can also be what are known as technical barriers to trade. For example, strict labelling rules or standards of production. And the picture on the right-hand side there is a chicken farm, and one of the topical debates at the minute is around the ability of an economy to import chlorine-treated poultry. So at the minute that is banned. I think since 1979 that's banned by the EU. But one of the issues of Brexit could be that the UK may decide to allow the import of chlorine-treated chicken, which is a common way of treating chicken in the US, into the UK. But at the minute, that ban acts as a form of protectionism against the import of US-produced chicken. So there we go, 4 different types of protection.
Okay, so this one is basically talking about standards. Different countries have different standards for the quality of the products that they'll accept. The EU and Germany have very strict standards about meat, in particular chicken. The Americans have a different feeling and different regulations regarding which kind of products they will accept in terms of how how the chickens are raised. So if you don't agree with the way, or you don't feel that it's safe for your people in your country, then you can create some regulations about what, it says technical barriers to trade. That would be a regulation about safety, like food safety. Also, you can grant licenses, or you can use intellectual property laws to protect your businesses. So protectionism is useful mostly for protecting your local businesses, to protect businesses that are weak and need time to get stronger, and also for national security. If you worry about the food that you have enough food for your public, for your society, you don't want to become dependent on other countries for your food, right? Because that would create a situation where you were unsafe. So you would want to protect your food sources, even if they were inefficient, even if they were a little bit more expensive than it would be for importing. So those are the main reasons for protectionism. Okay, so reducing trade barriers improves outcomes for consumers because it gives them easier access to more choice at lower prices. That's one of the benefits we saw before. It also creates competitive pressure on domestic industry. That's what we saw before. Okay, so I'm going to go to page 23 real quick and just look at the ANZ. Actually, the first part of it is this one is Australian and ASEAN free trade agreement. We can see a picture of ASEAN here, and I think I almost got it right. I think I got all the countries except for Singapore in the group. As we know, we are able to travel freely without having to have a passport now to Thailand, for example. So part of the free trade agreement can mean free movement of people today. Okay, first let's look at another one of these examples of a trade agreement. This one is the Australian, well, this is ASEAN, Australia and New Zealand free trade agreement. So why are they doing this? That's what I would ask. I would listen to these people speaking and think like, okay, what is it, what benefit are they describing that they're going to receive out of it? One clue is that New Zealand and Australia, if you combine their population, is less than 50 million people, whereas Southeast Asia is, this whole ASEAN is about 500 or 600 million people. So it's a much bigger market, so that's a huge opportunity, right?
This is essentially the Pacific Century, and what that means is that ASEAN and Australia and New Zealand have a huge possibility to build on the existing trading relationship. I think if we look at current trends, the rate of growth of trade is such that we could have something like $150 billion to $200 billion worth of trade between Australia, New Zealand and ASEAN, and that's up from 90 odd billion today. Now that may be a bit of blue sky thinking, but I think we have to think about this, in terms of a decade.
Where the interesting trend shifts are starting to occur is in some of the more emerging sectors, so particularly areas like clean energy, financial services, professional services, health and well-being and such. And of course that's because it's manifesting the shift that's happening in the region. It's now a population of some 600 million in ASEAN. By definition, because it's growing, that means that it's a younger population. And indeed, therefore, you're getting a stronger middle class coming through as middle class purchasing power as well. That manifests back to sort of thirst for the sorts of goods and services that we have to offer.
There's no question that services productivity is now becoming and being recognised as being vitally important for ASEAN countries. And that means opening it up, that means bringing in foreign skills, that means bringing in foreign investment in services. So all of those things say, yes, there are huge opportunities for Australia as ASEAN matures and as they get a middle class that really demands high quality services.
With ANZFETA, government has done its part It's negotiated what is a pretty good agreement by all accounts, and it's got all of ASEAN into the mix. But now it's up to business to actually look at these agreements, factor it into their business strategy, and take advantage of the incentives that this investment agreement provides.
So, what's happening there? Why are they doing it? Obviously, it's a huge market for Australian companies to enter. Unlike Korea, they're not so focused on electronics, they're focused on services. Can you think of any services? In fact, this is a service. Right now, education is a service. So, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about education services, financial services, legal services, and things like that. It's a huge market. They say there's a growing middle class, so it should add to the development of, for example, increase in demand for overseas education. So Australia is definitely interested in entering that market. RMIT is another example of that. Okay, so what are the key points in the ANZ Free Trade Agreement? Their goal, and you know, it may or may not happen, is to eliminate tariffs of Australian exports to ASEAN nations. Really? Eliminate tariffs on 96% of Australian exports to ASEAN nations by 2020. Singapore is a weird one though, right? They're different from all the other countries because their economy is developed. And the trade agreement, certified goods have their tariffs reduced when they enter the ASEAN countries. They say international arbitration is established to resolve foreign, so that sounds like there's an ISDS into this agreement. There's an international foreign investment disputes. Fourth, the free trade agreement sets minimum standards for the treatment of foreign investors and their investments within the other countries. So it definitely sets up a situation, so yeah, we have to worry about those investor mechanisms. So if the developing countries of Southeast Asia want to improve their environmental policies or raise their minimum wages, that might affect Australian companies and they may sue those countries. So it's a little bit dangerous. The main products that are being exchanged are on page 24. Meat, tariffs on meat, dairy products, those come from Australia, iron and steel. Also construction equipment, need a lot of construction equipment in Southeast Asia for the growing cities, so that would be a benefit too. So yeah, I think what the test question talked about was the Australian-New Zealand CERTA. So I think the last thing is today is the key points of this. I think you could highlight that. So besides tariffs being lowered, so let's highlight the bullet points in the center of page 24, and I think that would help to answer the question if you had a test question on this. Number one, all tariffs and restrictions on import and export between the two countries are prohibited. Both countries are fairly developed, so that makes sense. Two, minimize government industry assistance and export subsidies and incentives to ensure a level playing field. So basically increase competition by not allowing governments to help companies and give them money so they can stay alive even if they're inefficient. So a level playing field means no one gets support. Everyone has to fight on their own. Three, food standards are standardized, which means that the countries have to agree with the production methods of the different food products. So those are three main key points of the Australian and New Zealand Closer Economic Relations Trade Agreement. That's a bilateral agreement. So we looked at two. The first one, the ANZA Free Trade Agreement, is a multilateral agreement with New Zealand and all the ASEAN countries, and a bilateral agreement between Australia and New Zealand. So those are the main two. So I think that's it for today. I do not want to go further. It'll stick to the syllabus and basically talk about trade. That's it. I think I'm going to be, I'll talk about the next bullet point next week. All right, so that's it for this week. I'll assign some homework questions. We won't have our quiz until, I believe, Wednesday. I hope no one has ulna in this class. I hope not. You shouldn't. You should not have ulna if you're in an ATAR 12 class. Anyway, have a good weekend, and we'll see you next week.